Well, hello everyone. Welcome to NCSL's webinar, Redistricting Data 101. I am Wendy Underhill from NCSL's Elections and Redistricting team. I recognize many of the people who had registered for this, and I appreciate that you all were able to join us today. I know that we've all got a lot on our minds with COVID-19 and how it is impacting our work and our families, and perhaps we can think about spending this hour together as a little respite from coronavirus. And we'll always stay focused and try to stay committed to the important future work that we're all going to be doing. We'll be learning today about what all redistricting offices are likely working on right now and certainly into the future, and that's about gathering and managing the data that will be used next year for redistricting. Of course, we're all going to have to wait for the most important data of all, and that's the census data, and that data will get delivered to the states in a rolling fashion from mid-February to the end of March. But before then, there are all kinds of other data to find and to lock down, and that's what we'll be talking about today. Now, some of what we discuss today will be true in most states, but it may not all be true in your state. And if we know anything at NCSL, it's that every state varies a little bit from its neighbors. Before I introduce our fabulous presenters today, I've got a few logistical items. The first is that we have scheduled 75 minutes in total for this. The last 15 we picture as mostly being devoted to Q&A. And while I'm there, I'll just say that at the end of all of that, we'll pop up a survey, and that's an opportunity for you all to tell us what kinds of programming on webinars you are interested in the future. Of course, you can always send us an email, wendy.underhill@ncsl.org or elections-info@ncsl.org. Now I want to shift to the next slide. Would somebody do that for me, please?
Sure.
Thank you. We want to thank our sponsors for this redistricting seminar series and for this webinar. Many of you probably know that we had plans for in-person seminars in Las Vegas, Portland, and Washington, D.C. yet to come. The Las Vegas meeting was indeed canceled because of the virus. The others we're still expecting to be able to host, knock on wood. But these organizations highlighted on this slide have helped support the in-person seminars, this webinar, and a whole series of webinars yet to come. Second, there's a chat box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, and we encourage you to type questions or comments in there at any time. And in fact, how about right this very minute, why don't you all put in your state and perhaps your professional affiliation. It's kind of fun when you're on a webinar to know who else is on there with you. So let's see if we get some responses in there. I'm not seeing them. That makes me wonder if my screen isn't fully activated. There we go. Hi, Joseph. All right, good. You got the idea. Oh, Tricia, hello, hello. Okay, great. Looking like this is working just fine. And this is, of course, where you can put questions, and by all means do put questions in there at any point along the way. We do have a time in the middle that we've kind of identified as a place to take questions, and then, of course, the extra time at the very end. And then I also want to call your attention to the very top, kind of on the left. We have the resources tabs, and here you can find links to several NCSL resources on redistricting. That would include the starter kit for legislative staff and others, the Redistricting Law 2020 book, plus links to many of our web pages, so take a look up there. And also there's a tab labeled speaker, I believe, and that provides the bios for today's presenters. That's my lead-in to introducing, indeed, our presenters, Kim Brace and Clark Benson. You can read their bios because I'm not going to read them to you. But what I'd like to say is that these two experts have at least 4 redistricting cycles under their belts. And jointly, Kim and Clark are a powerful resource, as you will soon see. Separately, Kim is the president of Election Data Services, which primarily works for Democrats. And Clark is the president of Polydata, Inc., and he primarily works for Republicans. They're friends with each other. They're friends of NCSL, and I like to think that they're friends of mine as well. Kim is going to kick this off. Clark will take over a bit in the middle. There will be a chance for questions at that point. Then we'll move back to Kim, and let's see if we can't keep this fairly personal and conversational, at least as personal and conversational as we can, given the platform. So go ahead and add your thoughts and your comments in the chat box as we go. Kim, are you set to go?
I am ready.
All right. It is all yours.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this session. We're going to be talking about building a redistricting database. It's one of the big activities that you'll undertake right now. from our standpoint, who's Kim Brace? I've been involved with elections since 1972 and all sorts of wide variety of things. We end up doing the election result poster that many of you are familiar with. And indeed, those posters we hand out and give out to a lot of people. In 2010, we had a poster that the backside was the redistricting process. We're planning that for 2020. But if you want to get a copy of this 2010 one, just send me your address information and I'll send you a copy of it. We've been involved with redistricting in more than half the country, both from building databases and doing testimony and all sorts of different things on the redistricting side. Since 1980, we keep track of what kind of voting equipment is used in every single county in the country, so we're heavily involved there. And since 1990, we've been involved with a yearly study of reapportionment. In fact, both Clark and I both do these. We coordinate with each other to make sure that we're not saying something different than each other are coming up with the numbers. But our last set of numbers came out in December of 2019, and these are the projections of what we're seeing right now in terms of population change and who's going to gain or who's going to lose congressional seats. Now, one caveat to that is, of course, this was before all the virus activity. So who knows what this is going to be? You're going to have to stay tuned. So from today's discussion standpoint, what we're going to be talking about is the stepping stones of the election process and then the data cube for redistricting. Both of these are component pieces that are important to understand as you build your database. Databases have multiple purposes. First, of course, is plan drawing. You'll want that database so that you can do the plan drawing in the redistricting software that you select. That redistricting software generally needs data down to the lowest geographic area, and so that affects where things can be drawn and tallied up at a moment's notice. What that means is that data needs to be disaggregated. The precinct election return data needs to be brought down to the block because inevitably you may be splitting that precinct, and so you'll want the data down at the block level. There's different methodologies for doing that, and we'll get into that later on in the process. But right now, the other purpose of the databases is to do analysis, anything from racial block voting studies to mapping of results so that you can get a feel for where things are in your state, and then proportionality studies, which we can talk about later too. But first off, we want to talk about the election process from a data element perspective. If you recall, from a population standpoint and from a redistricting standpoint, we're all drawing districts on the basis of total population. But the key is that not everybody in total population can vote in the elections. Indeed, you have to be of voting age. Not everybody of voting age can vote in the elections process. In most places, you need to be citizen and of voting age. But not everybody of citizen voting age can vote in the process because you have to be registered in our system. And not everybody that's registered will vote in the process because you have to turn out. And not everybody that turns out ends up voting in each of the elections because we'll have some what we call drop-off in not only votes for president, it's less than the turnout is usually, but also votes for other statewide offices and congressional and state legislative. These are the stepping stones of the election process from a data element standpoint. It's important that these are there and that you start understanding them in your jurisdiction. Keep in mind that the demographic mix of the electorate in each of these stepping stones is likely to be different. Hispanics are more affected by this citizenship voting age population category than anything else. There's other demographic breaks where things are, so you end up needing to be cognizant of the fact that things are different at each stepping stone in the demographic mix of what's in your state. Indeed, from the standpoint, there is changes at each step of the process in that demographic mix. There is changes by different geography. California is different than New York or Illinois or Florida, but in fact also different places within your own state is different. Chicago is different from downstate Illinois. Miami-Dade is different than upper parts of Florida. All of those kind of factors come into play, and you need to have the database put together so that you can understand that in the data. The other key component is that changes happen over time. So this stepping stone and the demographic mix changes with each election. So indeed, if you're only looking at the 2020 election, you're not getting a full picture of what this demographic mix is in your state. So be cognizant of all three of those components. These stepping stones play an important part of the redistricting process. Now, to put together this database, you need to think in terms of a data cube. When you look at a data cube, you can look at the sources of the data that you're going to be dealing with. First off, you're going to have census as one source, and the other source is political. That's your sources of information. The types of data, those are going to be different also in this data cube. Your tabular data is one type of data, and spatial is the other type of data. So the components of all of this redistricting data cube deal with each of these parts. So we're going to look at and talk about these. We'll start with looking at, indeed, in 2020, what are you going to get from the census? Indeed, what you'll have on the spatial side is the Tiger file. Those files are now released on a yearly basis from the Bureau, and it's probably worthwhile for you to look at those because certainly changes in things like your city boundaries could be correspondingly caught and observed in different versions of the Tiger file. So it's important to take a look at that and be cognizant of that from the spatial standpoint. You'll be getting those Tiger files starting probably sometime in November of this year so that you can begin building some of your database. You won't get the PL data until later on, but you'll have the geographic components of the data starting in November going through February, according to the Census Bureau. Now, you may have other boundaries that may be important spatially, and so it's important to have those in there too. You may be collecting those from other areas, from other departments of the state government, for example. There's all sorts of different possibilities on that side, and outside sources too. From the standpoint of tabular data from the census, the main component will be your PL 94-171 file. That data will be available starting in probably February of 2021, going through the end of March, so that you'll be able to have the redistricting data by April 1st. So that will be the PL file. But you also have some other files from the Census Bureau, and that is the ACS data. And that will end up being available also as we go along. You might have other demographic files of census and tabular. You could be purchasing these from independent vendors. There's all sorts of different possibilities. But these are all census-related tabular data. Now, you may end up needing to look at and have 2010 data available in your database so that you can look at the change that's taken place in your state in those past 10 years. And it will give you a clue of what is happening in terms of the data in your state. It may be that you'll need to go back to 2000 if for some reason. And we'll get into that too. But when you look over on the political side of things, everybody thinks in terms of election returns and the voting studies and statistics that you might have. That's the most common component of political data that you'll be looking at and compiling. You may end up also looking for geographic voter registration files. That may help you in deciding where those precinct boundaries were if you're able to geocode voter files, for example. From the spatial side of things, in order to know where those election returns go, you need to have precinct maps. And that may be different for each election, because what's happening in the precinct maps is that you'll get in the PL file, if you participated with the Census Bureau's program, you'll get the 2020 precincts, whatever the last set that you submitted to the Bureau. But what do you do with the 2018 election, or the 2016 election, or the 2014 election? All of those could be under different geographic configurations within a particular county. Even going back to 2010 or 2012 and 2010, maybe even earlier. All of those are possible in terms of the political side of things. It's important to keep in mind that those stepping stones need to be reflected in your database and all of its components. So from the standpoint of what do you need to be collecting and have before you, first off, for every county and township in your state, for every precinct in every jurisdiction in your state, for each election in your state, you need to have the number of registered voters, and that may be by party if that's relevant for you in the 25 states that have that for registration by party. The other 25 states you don't, you just have total registration. You also need to know the number of people who turned out. That is an important component, looking at turnout elements. And that's not the number of votes that were cast for all of the candidates. Turnout is something separate. You may need to look at vote history coming from your jurisdictions. That's where you're going to find turnout information. But clearly the votes cast for each candidate in all the relevant elections is another component that you need. We always recommend that you look at and have in your database all statewide contests. That's because you're going to be making changes geographically, and what one consistent thing there is are statewide contests. So certainly having that. Any districted offices, you're going to be also involved in those because you're drawing those, you're looking at the congressional, state senate, state house, but keep in mind that each congressional or each state senate or each state house district will have a different mix of that stepping stone. And so it is important that as you look towards drawing districts, be cognizant of not adding different state senate district election results together to think of how that might be conveyed in terms of the potential strength in state senate contests. You got to be cognizant of where candidates existed or where they did not, and that could affect your data set. Certainly, there may be, if you're in a state that has referendums, there may be good data there in terms of referendum information, giving you a clue of not only candidate support, but support for positions. So if you have referendums, those are usually good to take a look at and see if they're something that could be useful in your data set, particularly if they're statewide referendums. There may be local contests that you may be thinking that may be important. So that's a component piece. Local contests like the mayor of Chicago if you're looking in Illinois, or the mayor of Miami if you're looking in Florida, or the mayor of Los Angeles if you're in California. Those kind of local contests could be relevant. And certainly for any kind of contest where you have a minority candidate. We'll get into the thing in terms of racial block voting, but anytime you had a minority candidate, you probably need to collect those election results so that you've got that. So, Clark, it is your turn.
Okay, so this is Clark Benson, and as Wendy said, pretty much Kim and I have had similar experiences over a similar period of time. We just happen to work for a different side of the aisle, generally speaking. But of course, there are some people in the middle, so we've both had some experience in working with other entities as well. And as Kim has said, a lot of his focus is to deal with the information. I mean, the key thing that no one else does basically is he collects all the information on voting machines and the type of machines that are in each county as they change over time. And that brings up another point. Kim and I have also worked on the EAC process, and that's the kind of information that we need to have for that. And the one thing that I have done over the decades that most people are smart enough to not do is to aggregate all the presidential votes for all the congressional districts in each election. So that's kind of a time-consuming process, obviously, but obviously the end result of redistricting. So I'm going to have a few comments on slide 13. Kim, could you just go back to that? And you can just...
Sorry about that.
And, yeah, so just put them all out there because I'm not going to talk about each one.
Yep, they are all out there.
Well, okay, that's good because I only see the title. So just a couple of comments on this. And again, every precinct in jurisdiction for each election, and you'll have to remember also that in some cases, precinct boundaries will change between the primary and the general. So you have to at least be cognizant of that. On the party registration, as Kim said, there are only basically half the states that have it. I believe Rhode Island and Utah have joined that pack in the last decade or so. And so basically there are four types of states when it comes to party registration. There's the ones that do not have it. And then there are basically three types of, as I say, characterized by the degree to which the independents are unaffiliated or whatever are there. There are a handful of states that, of course, it's less than 10 or 15%. There are a handful of states where it's, in fact, the plurality of the three, the Rep Dem and the others, is, in fact, the others. And then there's the rest. As just a kind of a context, the average independent other vote registrants has gone from 25% in 2000 to about 30% in 2016 as an average. And frankly, in some states it's changed a lot, but in most states it's pretty much has just moved up. On the statewide contest, I think there are two things you can consider that, although it's so easy to get the data now, it's really hardly worth fighting over it, but you don't really need uncontested statewide races. You need it when you're doing legislative races. You need to know which districts are contested or not. A statewide race that's certainly on the bottom of the ballot doesn't really matter much, doesn't add much. And likewise, basically nonpartisan races, even though they're statewide, don't. But the other thing you have to consider for statewide is in some states they have like Board of Education or things like this, which are multi-member or Supreme Court justices. So you have to consider those as well. And those are always tricky because, of course, you get more votes than you do for a single member race. You have to divert it somehow. And also, there are statewide races other than congressional, state senate, state house. Like in some states, you have a PUC, Public Utilities Commission, and they will have districts, or in some cases, they will have seats, but they still run statewide. And those are different, but you want to consider that. And like at least New Hampshire has the executive council races, which again is by district. The last two here, from the standpoint of local contest and minority candidates, in a sense, these are kind of not an option, but they can be an auxiliary data set. They don't necessarily need to be in your redistricting data set per se as it goes into the redistricting software. That's an option. But you certainly need to have them. But we'll find that for a lot of the local and/or races in which a minority candidate ran, you're probably going to be better off having that as a separate data set that you can easily hand over to your analyst. But it's certainly a nice thing to have it in your database. So I guess now you can go to, well, I guess I was going to go to next, wasn't I? The trade-off of who gets to hit the button. Okay, so election data considerations. This is kind of a continuation of the previous discussion. And okay, so obviously, as we discussed, you want primary election data, but primaries really depend, again, on your state. First off, is it a primary state? Some states are still basically conventions, so they don't add much. But again, if you're from a racial block voting standpoint, you want to have. So you've got to consider that. But general elections, obviously, you have to have. How far back in time, and I'm sure Kim meant to say 2010 when he said how far back to go, but his point was that, in fact, that was a significant election. So you want to have that there, even though it's a long time ago, just as a frame of reference. And I think the point here on a frame of reference is you'll have all sorts of different people asking questions about a plan or about a county or anything. And you want to have the data available to answer most of those questions. So they may think that the 2010, even though it was 10 years ago, was a very important election, and in their mind, that's the key. Just like most people would think the presidential election in each quadrennial is important, as opposed to the gubernatorial election in the off years. So precinct maps, yes, clearly you need to have maps. And this goes back to what Kim said about the VTDs. First off, of course, and I'm hoping everybody in the audience understands this, the VTDs, even if your state froze the boundaries for the 2018 election and you submitted it, you participated in Phase 2, you submitted it to the Census Bureau, and they provide that back when you get the data by the VTDs. Of course, that's only the VTDs for the precincts as you've configured them for the 2018 election. So if you want to actually get information by precinct for previous years, you can add it up from the blocks in your data set if, in fact, you have tagged them with the actual precinct from there. So there's some kind of tricky things from the standpoint of VTDs. We consider them precincts, but really there are a lot of subtleties to it. Absentee votes, and there are two bugaboos of the data developer: absentee votes and split precincts. Absentee votes are basically non-geographic votes. They may be for an entire county. They may be by townships within a county. They may, in fact, be by wards within a city. To actually use these in your database, you're going to have to account for them some way. And that, unfortunately, is tricky because, again, most elections, even though Secretary of State compiles the data, gets everything ready, even if they have precinct boundaries, the local officials are usually still the people that decide how you're going to have the votes tabulated, unless there's some election law. The other aspect, and for 2 here, is only tallied by ballot style. Again, there's ballot style and then there's means of voting. A ballot style is basically which parts of which district are in that precinct. So it may be, it may be split by 2 legislative districts, but the other 2 are the same. So that's something you have to keep track of. The voting means of voting is when you get to the point and they break it out by who voted absentee, but they report it by precinct, or who voted by in person by precinct. So is that an incentive for me to move on? That mine says the other slide now. Yes, absentee voting has increased over time, so that's it for that. But split precincts, again, are a major bugaboo from the standpoint of developing your data, because you will generally only get the result for the race that is split. So again, if a precinct is part of 2 legislative districts, you'll get the votes for each legislative race, but you won't get the gubernatorial vote. You frequently will not even get the turnout. So that's a problem, and unfortunately, you have to deal with these things, and it shows up again. Voting centers and such are another problem which has grown over time, and that's likewise, you have to come up, it's similar to basically having absentee votes they have to look at for the entire county. You have to find some way to spread them out. And Kim will go over that in some of the disaggregation part. So I guess now we can go to, oh yes, well, don't assume it's in one place for sure. Now, there are more Secretaries of State that have complete files. A lot of them have Clarity or whatever the other one is, Vital. So you can, in fact, get the information easily, but the quality of statewide databases varies widely, shall we say, and especially in the Northeast and Midwest, where it's largely by town, where counties don't really mean anything. There's always problems with that. So let's go through this one briefly, too. Okay, so Kim went over the geography. Yeah, so political precinct boundaries. Clearly, the question here is, do you in fact go back to 2010? It seems so long ago. Why don't we just go back to, say, 2012? Well, again, there's several different reasons like that. The first is, as we said, some people still think 2010 is a nice touchstone for them. They want to have that so they can compare it. My recommendation is you do the entire decade, but the problem is that's only 5 elections. And if you do 5 elections, each decade you're going to have a different mix of on years and off years. So my suggestion is you at least be cognizant of that fact, that in fact you can't compare a previous decade with this decade as well, even though they're redistricting cycles, because in fact there are different turnout methods, averages, and participation in each type. You can't have data unless you know where it comes from. That goes back to the basic point of what's the standard of care that needs to be used in developing your database. Eventually, your court's going to see your database. I'll rephrase that. Eventually, your database is going to be revealed in court. And as Kim and I understand, from previous experience, experts on the other side will be relentless in finding the minor details that do not necessarily mean anything in your database, but show that you didn't spend the amount of time that you needed to do to get it correctly. As I said, racial voting analysis is trickier, and you do, in fact, have the missing link for any racial voting analysis, which is at least easier to decipher now or discover, is the race of the candidate. I think there are 2 things you need to know about any race any election that you think is going to be useful for racial block voting analysis. One is, how many candidates were there, and what was the result of their vote? In other words, was it a washout, or was it a closely contested race, or whatever? And then the second thing is you need to know the race of the candidates. I say it's easier to find that now because, in fact, you have the internet. So it does, in fact, help a lot there. But it does get to be the point where you still need to have that information compiled ahead of time. And in fact, a lot of the racial block voting data, you should have, there are so many little steps here, you should have an analyst, someone who's going to actually probably be an expert witness, looking at that information this year. So the other aspect is other political boundaries. We do have school districts. The census gives the school districts on Tiger. How current they are is a question. But that, from the standpoint of looking at local elections and such, that may in fact be helpful. The other thing is it may be helpful if in fact you have a county supervisor or a county council by district or something. In some counties, you may want to have that as well. But again, that's going to be a lot more work. But you have to consider that. So I think that's all I have for now. And now Kim, I guess, will take over. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I go two more, don't I? Oh.
Yes, that's right.
Oh, gosh. Okay, so ACS data. Now, Kim did say this too, which is you can get ACS data now, basically that's already formatted for your software package, your redistricting software package. And comment there is, notwithstanding the fact that it's formatted, the redistricting software packages are pretty much geared up to take data in and out. I don't want to say expeditiously, but if you are at all data savvy, it's easy to do that. So you don't have to build your database within the redistricting software. You use that basically as a display mechanism and to draw maps and to import other maps to analyze them. The key thing to ask there is if you don't have the tools in your database to analyze it, then you have to back it out. Well, the ACS data now is something that you can in fact get, but of course it isn't going to be as current. There is now a 1-year release and a 5-year release. So the 1-year release that just came out in the end of 2019 was a sample of all the responses from the 2018 survey year. The 5-year would have been the previous 5 years of information. So in fact, that had an average collection date basically at the middle of 2016. Citizenship data, and Kim will go over this a little bit as well, but we don't quite know how we're going to get that or if we're going to get it. So, but we know we don't know for sure it's not going to be on the PL 94, but I think that's highly unlikely. It is more likely to be a special tabulation that the Bureau will produce, and you'll have to marry them together, but theoretically, using the block, it shouldn't be a big deal. Group quarters is, again, there are two types of group quarters. They're institutionalized and non-institutionalized. And so there's been this movement, so-called prison gerrymandering, to take those people out of the location, the census block basically, of the location of their institution and repatriate them, as it were, to their home. So that's what the group quarters information is there. But that's a big job, and I've forgotten half a dozen states that do it now. SF1 data and possibly ancestor data brings us to, in fact, the next slide. Sorry. Okay, so here's these two questions are substantially similar to what we've had since the 2000 census. There's the Hispanic origin question, and then there's the race question. And the orders remain the same. First, you say whether you're Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin. And it's pretty obvious what that is. And then there's a yes, another Hispanic. So in other words, if you are a group that is not listed, you print that in. That's pretty much the same as it has been. The race one on the right is substantially different, actually. Substantively, it's pretty much the same. There are 6 race categories, but it's hard to see that here because you can see there's white, black, American Indian, or Alaska Native, and then skip over the last, but at the bottom there's other. So between Alaska Native and other is actually Asian and Pacific Islander. Those are the 2 race categories. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 6. you can answer basically up to 6. But the way the form is structured, it seems to me, if you're a Chinese and Korean, you can check those as well. But this information that is in the printed box is what we call the ancestry data. And in fact, it says at the top of the form, mark one or more boxes and print origin. So whereas with the Hispanic origin question, that's obviously only for Hispanics, that will fill it in. On this side, now you have basically what used to be a long form question when we had the long form. You get ancestry data. So if you're a German French, you can say German, France, right there. And they will presumably tabulate that. That goes to the SF1 data that was mentioned on the previous slide. That is where that kind of information will be broken out. As with the other part of the SF1 is it will break out racial categories as well. So I think that's it for now. The only other thing is, remember, race, especially the race, is self-identified. There's no actual right or wrong answer, so anybody can put in whatever they want. So now Tim will take over with the next slide.
All right. Before I do, just one other thing to keep in mind on the PL data. This race data now, for the last time at least, and you will for this time, you can have 2 or more, or 3 or more, or 4 or more different categories that you could be checking off. So that is part of the data elements that come into play from your PL file. And how big that is remains to be seen in some of the other discussions we'll have. Next-wise, as I said, you could pick up to 6 choices on that side, on the racial side. So the question is, the elephant in the room, we've already had some questions on that, and that is the question of citizenship. You're not going to see this question on the census form. That was what was knocked out. The Trump administration tried to put it in, and the courts knocked it out. But you may see an alternative of this, and that is the use of administrative records. And that information, from what I understand, will be available at approximately the same time as the PL data comes about. We'll wait and see. They're testing out how well their collection of the administrative records has been, but in theory, this would give us citizenship numbers by voting age population. That could have a big impact on this. How will the data be tabulated and incorporated into a similar PL type file? Will there be crosstabs with race and Hispanic origin or not? Will there be multi-race categories like the PL where you've got up to 6 different choices? All of those are questions that are still remaining to be answered as the Bureau looks at this elephant in the room and the use of the citizenship data in administrative records. Will there be margins of error maybe being shown, similar to if administrative records are shown and data involved in that? And what will be the impact on our analysis and our reports as we're looking at citizenship? These are all questions that are kind of outstanding and remains to be seen in what we get. There are database considerations also. You could end up having cluster information where you might have communities of interest there. You could, in fact, be geocoding of voter files, where we have statewide voter registration files courtesy of HAVA. Now you can end up getting statewide voter files that could be geocoded, where you could get information, political information, down to the individual census block level if you geocode those. Indeed, here's voter files that have been geocoded. The red dots are the houses, and the white numbers are the numbers of voters that are in each house here. So you can start compiling that information if you've got a statewide voter file, and you can geocode that. Now, part of what we end up going to be doing and taking a look at is this whole disaggregation process. And this disaggregation process is needed to be done in order to bring precinct-level election results down to the census block. And in order to do that, you're going to encounter the disaggregation process. It's basically looking at what percent of a precinct's vote should come from each census block that makes up that precinct. And there's several different ways of dealing with that disaggregation process and methods that might be available. So if we look at the disaggregation, you might look at from a GIS standpoint. If you're now having staffers that are involved with GIS, they may think the easiest thing to do is spatially look at what's there. Indeed, let's say that this middle area, you've got 4 census blocks that make up the precinct here. And indeed, if you look at data within the PL file or in the Tiger file, you have the number of square feet in each census block. So you could add up the square footage in each census block to see what percent of the total square foot are in each of those census blocks. And that could be your denominator for figuring out where the data resides. Indeed, so if you've got 10,580 square feet, that would be about 37% of that precinct's election results would go in this upper census block. The problem with that is that spatially while it's used from a GIS standpoint, it's not very good for where people are, and I'll show you that. What you can look at instead, you could look at a count of buildings in a census block. Indeed, you can look at the topological maps that are available, and you can see down at the bottom here the little black dots that are basically buildings, and you could figure out how many buildings there are. Even modern maps that you can find might give you a clue in terms of building footprints. So indeed, in this area again, we can see that the Manassas Courthouse is does 2 buildings here, but next to it are 3 buildings along that bottom part, but a bunch of buildings on the top part. That top part now, of all the 13 buildings in that block, 53% are in that upper portion of that block. That may be a good way of disaggregating the election results down based on number of buildings in a block. You could also take a look at the total population. Indeed, here's the total population in each of those 4 census blocks. That may be another way of looking at this disaggregation. So those 15 people of all the 59 people in this precinct, that 15 people contributes 25.4% of the precinct's population comes from that area. The 18 people down below on the right is 30%. Those could be your denominators for disaggregating your election results. But total population doesn't get you down that stepping stone that we talked about at the beginning. You want to get closer to what real voters are in terms of the data. So you could look at voting age population. That's available within each census block. The 7 people up on the top of that census, or that top census block, account for 20% of the 35 people in that precinct. That could be your denominator if you wanted to use voting age population. But you also have the potential that you could make use of aerial photographs now. You could see where the building prints are in aerial photographs. Some old ones give you some clues, but indeed the most current vintage of an aerial photograph of this precinct, you see this area on the bottom right-hand side, that's the courthouse down there. I know that very well because I used to work in that building. But out in front of the courthouse and out in front of the election results office, or the election returns office, is a big parking lot. Those three buildings down at the bottom in that space down there, they're no longer there. They were taken out probably 3 decades ago. So the only people in this precinct are what's up on top in that apartment building right there. And that's where, if you look at some information like that, 100% of your election results would be in that census block up on top, not what you're seeing elsewhere. So you can end up having all sorts of different denominators to help you in this disaggregation process. The geocoding of lists of voters can also be used in that voter registration data to retally the data by census block or by split block. Indeed, you can start utilizing that information to help in this disaggregation process if you have the capability of geocoding, like what we did here. You need to get good geocoding capabilities in order to make use of that. You need to have know your precinct configurations for each election year. Know which blocks go into each precinct. That's important for this disaggregation process. And don't assume they stay the same throughout the decade. Inevitably, somewhere in your state, you'll see some changes in precinct boundaries over that decade, and you may need to find that old precinct map. That can be the biggest problem that you'll come into play in building this database. People tend to keep those election results, but they throw away the precinct maps of old, unfortunately, but that's the facts of what we have to deal with sometimes. So, other outstanding questions that we have. One of the other questions that have come before us and talked about in the chat room is disclosure avoidance or disclosure privacy. That is a debate that's going on right now. I'm actually part of a small group of what they call the expert group to look at this data and look at how that comes into play and what's possible. So I'm involved in that. It's getting very mathematically inclined, but I'm trying to keep them cognizant of the redistricting side of things, of what we need to be dealing with that. How is the data going to be presented if there is disclosure avoidance and being put into play? Will they be able to show which numbers are real or adjusted? Is the total population that they said is going to be invariant? In other words, it's not going to change. Those are going to be the accurate numbers, but what about the racial data that make up the total population or the voting age population? That's all still subject to some question marks in this process. Will we need to think in terms of poll results where we've got a plus or minus 3% in terms of the data? There could be a bunch of information, and whether or not the data is overall usable or what. How the data is tallied may be what you need to think about. If you're using larger geography in making up your plan, the disclosure avoidance appears not to be as significant a factor as opposed to smaller geography. So if you're down to splitting precincts and down at the block level, you could have some real significance in terms of this disclosure avoidance issue. Again, we remain to see what's going to happen, but we will know sometime by the summer. So, lessons learned the hard way for both Clark and I. As Clark said, you have to plan your process as if you're ultimately going to be in court. Indeed, think about that. Are you prepared to turn over your data to the other side? They're going to ask for it, more than likely. Will it withstand scrutiny? Does everything add up to what was certified in terms of the election results? You need to be able to document some discrepancies. Indeed, in some of the election results may be a problem in terms of that. So you need to be able to take a look at that as you build your database. After all, database building, it's the most important activity of the whole process. An error here can sink your whole ship if you don't do it right. So for 2020, make sure you've got fast computer connections. Make sure you have lots of disk space. And start now. Don't wait. As most people remember, yesterday was Census Day. So, did everybody fill out your census form yet? Did you have to stand still in order to do that? Courtesy of Bill Keene from yesterday. Indeed, people that know me know that I love cartoons, so I collect redistricting cartoons from around the country. But when you do redistricting, inevitably it will end, and then somebody else has to clean up that mess. So, this is how you can contact either Clark or I, and indeed, we can take questions. So, Wendy, I'm going to turn it back to you in terms of you've been seeing where those questions are coming from.
Yes, indeed, and I want to thank both you, Kim, and Clark. I heard both of you talk before, and every time you do, I just learn that much more. So I really appreciate what you've done. And could you just imagine, please, that everybody who's listening is offering applause? They're sitting at their desks clapping for you right now. Okay, we're going to do questions. I do want to, though, encourage everyone to sign up for the next 11 redistricting webinars. That's a lot, a full dozen if you count today. The next one is April 16th, when redistricting software vendors will show their wares. And after that, we have 2 per week from April 21st through May 21st. And we will send all of you who were here today a link so that you can sign up for those. On the questions, I've got a couple of things. And one, we've had so much going on the chat box about redistricting or about differential privacy, and I wanted to share what we heard from James. He responded to me by email, and he says, so the question was, Census plans to use differential privacy to eventually include ACS, at least initially, and what would the impact be for smaller geographic areas? Some data may not be initially available below the county line. What's the impact of differential privacy for redistricting? So James's answer, and then I'm going to come to you, Clark, was the Census Bureau is committed to protecting the data it collects and is implementing differential privacy for all 2020 census data products, including the redistricting data. The state population totals for apportionment being an exception, where those numbers will be reported as enumerated. And the Bureau is working with the Department of Justice, the National Academy of Sciences, and many other stakeholders to ensure the fitness of use of the published 2020 census data. And I will say that Kim is one of those other stakeholders, and he mentioned that before. Clark, what can you offer us on differential privacy, please?
Well, Kim mentioned it a few slides back too. He's got is total pop changeable or just racial characteristics, and in essence, going on what Wendy just cited from James, the total population at the block level will be not the count. Let's put it that way. In other words, the only total population in the PL94 data set that will in fact match the count is the state level number. And that's basically only because they need to run the apportionment formula on the real numbers. Everything below that for population will be an altered number based upon the adjustment factors that they put in, except for some minor things. Housing counts and group quarters, you'll get the count of those units. But every other number, to the extent that it is out there, will in fact be altered somehow. Now, this is basically a factor of the overall concern about privacy, but also because, as Kim mentioned, the record is incredibly long and has all these cross-tabulations that break things down so that there's very little privacy when there's only one person out of the 175 options you have there. So that's their concern, and that's why they're trying to do this very sophisticated disclosure process, whereas in the past they would have had very simple techniques, basically swapping people from one block to another, but for characteristics, but you still had the population number. Well, now you're not even going to have a population number that's going to add up. It's not going to be real, and of course there's inevitably going to be some inaccuracy and some bias in the process. But that's one reason why Kim is on this working group. So it's quite problematic and would really be a sea change from the standpoint of the way redistricting is done.
Thanks very much, Clark. I will say that NCSL has a web page called Differential Privacy and the Census Explained. I don't know that it actually explains it really well because you might need to have some advanced degrees to understand it fully. But I will say to all of you on the phone that if your state is concerned about this, NCSL wants to hear about it. We don't have a next step together on this. We do have an action alert that draws it to people's attention, and I think there's two major places where it may be an issue. One is with redistricting, which most of you folks are probably interested in, and the other would be at local level where numbers might be more varied from what is known to be true on the ground. So keep us posted if you have any insight into this or if you're interested in more information on it. Let's see, I'm going to shift gears just a little bit, and Kim, I think I'll ask you to address this. This came from Jeff. He asks, why is it important to consider CVAP in light of the controversy over the census citizenship question, which you ably explained is not on the form? And how does CVAP factor into VAP data?
Well, the key in terms of CVAP, or citizenship voting age population, is how it relates to all the stepping stones that we talked about earlier. It is a component in there, and because the demographic mix of CVAP is different than the voting age population, or different than the registration numbers, or different than all those stepping stones in that graphic there, it's important to be able to understand how that demographic mix changes at each step. And it will change, and it will change in citizenship voting age population. That data, in theory, is now going to be there from what the Bureau has said. They're still waiting to see how well the collection of the administrative records are, and so we'll find out more later on this summer as it relates to that. But be cognizant as you think in terms of your database, it may very well be a set of data that you'll need to think about incorporating within your data set. Again, from what we understand from the Census Bureau, it would be coming out close to when the PL file is released. It may not be the same day, but it's going to be close to then. So you need to be cognizant. Again, we'll find out where they stand in terms of the citizenship, hopefully later on this summer, so that we can all plan or or plan to take our vacations or whatever the case may be.
Perfect. And while we're on the question of citizenship, there was a question in the chat box that James has answered. The question was, is there any comment on the Census Bureau producing a special citizenship tab for redistricting? And the answer, and I've put that in the chat box as well, the Census Bureau has committed to produce a block-level citizenship by voting age, by race, and ethnicity special tabulation prior to April 1st, 2021. And the link to learn more about that is in the chat box. We're almost out of questions there, but I do want to say that there's one other about, David asked way early on, whether there's a need for local election results as well as statewide when you're developing your database.
The example that I would have is if you have a large metropolitan area or a large city within your state that is important enough to be cognizant, for example, city of Chicago versus the rest of the state, in all likelihood, you may want to have the mayor's race in your database. It happened recently, and it's giving you another clue in terms of the voting characteristics of your constituency there. So that's where you might see that local contest may be a good clue that could give you some information. Keep in mind, of course, that the geography is only going to be part of your state that you're going to see this, and so it may not be something that you could utilize downstate or elsewhere, but indeed it is something that is possible. You might want to think about that.
And you, this is from me, Kim, you used the phrase geocode voter files, and would you explain that for all of us, please? What does it mean if you have a geocoded voter file, and why do we care?
What that means is that you're able to spatially see where that voter address is located. And when you spatially see it, then you can see what census block that falls within. And by doing that, then you're able to tally up any of the characteristics that you might have from your voter file, how many people participated in each election, if you've got vote history, for example. All that can be relevant that you can tally up to the census block level and have that then in your data set.
Excellent. I've just realized that at least some people may not be seeing their chat box anymore, and I'm sorry if there's a technical thing that's holding us up. I guess some other people can, because I see the question from Karen, which geocoder do you use? Maybe you can both answer that question.
Actually, that is a good question. It's a heavily GIS component question. What we end up taking a look at is multiple geocoder possibilities. What we have found in some states, if you have an E911 file that gives you a positional place of each household, and that E911 file is very good, that may be your best geocoder possibility, because it would have all of the addresses within your state. I know up in Rhode Island, where I do a lot of work, we've got an excellent E911 file. So we use that in order to geocode the voters, because indeed those firemen are going out there every day where there's a new house being built, because they may have to get to that to provide services at the last minute. So that could be used as a geocoder. Again, you'll need to investigate what is available within your state.
And Clark, anything extra you want to add on geocoding?
No, but I did want to add something to the local elections.
Oh, please do, yes.
Which is, it goes back to what I was saying about, to some extent, about balancing the on-year and the off-year. The only point in having local elections in your database is if they're, for other than racial block voting analysis, but to have them for political purposes is if they're on the ballot the same time that the congressional or the legislative races are on. In other words, a lot of states have local elections either a different time in the same year or, in fact, in a different year. So they may provide some minimal use to someone who wants to know the answer, but generally speaking, they're not going to be as the example that Kim mentioned. But if you do have like, city council elections and stuff like that on the ballot at the same time, then it's certainly worth considering.
I can imagine that local redistrictors care a whole lot about that, but for this purpose, we're talking about state level and congressional, so that's different. I'm going to ask each of you
We'll let them build their own databases.
Right, yeah.
Okay. And each of you, last word on this, something you wish people would take away. Clark, let's start with you.
Know the status of your data sets. This kind of under the lessons learned the hard way. While you're developing the data set, you're always checking things out. You spend all this time working on it, considering all these options and all these considerations that, in fact, will help your database survive in court. But it's hard to make things foolproof because fools are so clever. And once you get the data into your data set, doesn't mean somebody didn't screw around with it. So the point is you should periodically, unless you are perfectly confident in the person that has access to it could not screw around with it, then you should occasionally do proofing. So that means make sure you have a perfect version of your data set that was input into the redistricting software, and then check that, not every so often, but whenever you have to send it away somewhere, because you could be unruly surprised at some of the data.
Oh my gosh, now you've scared me. Before you answer, Kim, I just want to remind everyone we will have a survey at the end, so please do stay along with us for that and let us know what other kinds of programming you'd like in the future. And now, Kim, the last word is yours.
Last word is, if you haven't started, you're already late. Indeed, you need to get going on building the databases. There's a lot of things to do. There's a lot of information to collect. And you've got the time right now. It may be from the home that you're calling the county clerks from, but at least you've got some time now that you can try to get this done.
Fabulous. Oh, my gosh. So I know that both of you are willing to take questions, and your contact information is up there. NCSL is happy to be the conduit for those questions or handle anything else that we can. Thank you all very much for spending your lunch hour with us, or whatever time of the day it is where you are. And with that, I'm going to say thank you again and call it a wrap. Thanks. Bye.
Good. Thank you.
Nice thought.